In Maryland, the year 2001 left behind more than memories. It left behind a mystery. Brandon Ellis Rourke, 23, a hard-working auto repair apprentice, and his younger brother Tyler, 20, a bright community college student, vanished on a quiet summer evening. Their car was later found abandoned near a wooded trail. Doors open, keys inside, no signs of struggle. Just silence. Despite frantic searches, years of police efforts led nowhere. Rumors of corruption, false leads, and community frustration only deepened the wounds. But 2 decades later, an unexpected DNA breakthrough shattered the silence and led to an arrest that stunned the community. Before we begin, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Brandon Ellis Rourke was the kind of young man everyone seemed to trust instinctively. At 23, he had the look of someone older, square shoulders, oil-stained hands, and a calm, deliberate manner that made him appear years beyond his age. He worked full-time as an auto repair apprentice at Bill's Garage, a corner shop operation just outside their suburban Maryland neighborhood. Brandon wasn't just the guy who could fix your carburetor. He was the kind of person who would stick around afterward to make sure your car got home safely if it was still sputtering. His younger brother, Tyler Marcus Rourke, was a different kind of soul. At 20, he was all nervous energy and creativity, bouncing between classes at Montgomery Community College, late-night doodles and sketchbooks, and skateboard rides through empty parking lots. He had a gift for illustration, especially cityscapes and surreal, dreamlike images. While Brandon was planning to open his own garage someday, Tyler dreamed of designing comic books or animated storyboards for films. Different paths, different paces, but the bond between them was unshakable. The Rourkes lived in a modest 2-story home in the town of Olney, just under an hour from Baltimore. Their parents, Greg and Marlene, were high school sweethearts who'd married young and worked hard ever since. Greg was a sanitation worker. Marlene ran the front desk at a local clinic. Money was tight, but the boys never went without what they needed. Discipline was firm, affection was constant, and Sunday dinners were sacred. The neighborhood was tight-knit, the kind where you knew your mailman's first name and kids still rode their bikes until dusk. Brandon and Tyler had grown up among the same families they still waved to as adults. Their childhoods had been filled with backyard birthday parties, 4th of July cookouts, and hours at the local rec center gym. Even as they got older, they stayed rooted in the rhythm of their small-town life. When they weren't working or studying, the Rourke brothers often helped out around the neighborhood. Brandon had a reputation for fixing up lawnmowers or checking brakes on elderly neighbors' cars, refusing payment every time. Tyler, meanwhile, offered to paint murals for the local youth center and babysit for a single mom 2 doors down. They weren't saints, just good kids trying to do right in a world that often didn't. To the outside world, the Rourke brothers seemed untouched by the chaos that sometimes slipped into other parts of Maryland in the early 2000s. The opioid crisis was rising. Crime in nearby urban centers was creeping outward, but Olney still felt safe, still felt small. And for Brandon and Tyler, it was home. Their routines were simple. Brandon worked weekdays from 8 to 5, occasionally grabbing shifts on Saturdays. Tyler attended class Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Tuesdays and Thursdays he worked the register at an independent bookstore called Eastfield Books. Weekends were flexible, sometimes a movie with friends, a burger run, or an impromptu pickup game of basketball at the community court. But more than anything, they had each other. There were inside jokes that had lasted since childhood, nicknames no one else understood, and a shared language of gestures and glances that only siblings so close in age could master. They had their squabbles, usually over music, chores, or who finished the milk. But even arguments were short-lived. Their loyalty ran deeper than words. That July, life was unfolding as expected. Brandon had recently gotten a small raise. Tyler had been offered a small scholarship for the fall semester. Their parents were planning a barbecue for Marlene's birthday. Everything was in motion, steady and hopeful. No one saw what was coming. Because beneath the gentle surface of this Maryland town, under the routines, the smiles, the borrowed lawn equipment, something darker was stirring. Somewhere out there, an invisible thread had already been pulled. A plan had been set in motion. And the Rourkes, in all their ordinary beauty, had no idea they were about to walk into the storm. How could lives so grounded in goodness become targets of something so sinister? While Brandon and Tyler Rourke appeared to move through life without much turbulence, there were subtle cracks that most people didn't notice, moments that would, in retrospect, raise eyebrows. At the time, though, they were just that, subtle. Brandon had recently confided in his coworker at the garage that he was thinking about stepping away for a bit. Too much noise in town, he'd said. Too many people asking too many questions. At the time, it sounded like a vague comment about local drama. The garage wasn't immune to rumors. Mechanics caught with drugs, shady customers paying in cash, old cars used for who knows what. But Brandon had never been involved. If anything, he was the one who stayed out of trouble. That's what made the remark unsettling. Vague. Quiet. Tyler, on the other hand, had become increasingly withdrawn during the summer. His professors noticed he stopped staying after class to chat about projects. His best friend Nate mentioned Tyler started skipping weekend skate sessions. One afternoon, Tyler told him something strange. Brand's worried about someone. He won't say who. When Nate pressed him for details, Tyler waved it off like it was nothing. But something in his voice, a flicker of fear maybe, stuck with Nate. The brothers were close, but even between them, there were secrets. Brandon was fiercely protective. Tyler was loyal to a fault. If one was in trouble, the other would go down with him before breathing a word to anyone else. That bond, so often admired, would later be questioned. Had it cost them their lives? The week before the disappearance, Greg Rourke noticed his sons acting strangely. One night, he overheard Brandon arguing on the phone. The door was shut, but the tone was unmistakable. Tense, clipped, urgent. Greg had wanted to knock, to ask what was wrong, but he didn't. He figured it was something to do with work, maybe a customer dispute. In hindsight, that silence haunted him. Marlene, too, had sensed a shift. Tyler had always kissed her cheek before heading out. That week he seemed distracted, even distant. "Love you, Ma," he'd say, but his eyes wouldn't meet hers. When she asked what was going on, he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just stressed about finals," he told her. The words were plausible. The tone was not. On July 7th, 2001, the Rourkes had dinner as usual. Grilled chicken, roasted potatoes, lemonade. Brandon was unusually quiet. Tyler was fiddling with his phone, barely eating. Around 8 p.m., Tyler stood and grabbed his skateboard. "We're meeting the guys at Ronnie's diner," he said. Brandon followed, keys in hand. "Won't be late," he promised. Marlene watched them leave through the screen door, two silhouettes moving toward the fading sun. She never saw them again. What no one knew at the time was that the brothers weren't heading straight to the diner. Instead, they made a detour, one that would later become the focal point of the investigation. Surveillance footage, discovered weeks later, showed their car idling near an abandoned service station on the edge of town, Brandon in the driver's seat, Tyler in the passenger. The timestamp, 8:17 p.m. They never appeared on camera again. This change in route, so slight, so easily missed, would later be interpreted as a sign that they were meeting someone. But who and why? Rumors began to swirl in the days that followed. That Brandon had stumbled onto something he shouldn't have at the garage. That Tyler had accidentally witnessed something at the bookstore involving a local off-the-books dealer. That someone, unknown, unnamed, had been following them for weeks. But in those final hours before they vanished, nothing seemed out of place to the outside world. No alarm bells. No final texts. Just two brothers stepping into the night, bound by blood and something else. Something unspoken. What really happened after 8:17 p.m., and why did no one see them again after that moment? By the time the sun rose on July 8th, Marlene Rourke felt the first pangs of dread. She hadn't heard the boys come home. The driveway was empty. The house was silent. It wasn't like them, especially Brandon, who always made a point to text or call if they were running late. Still, she tried not to panic. Maybe they'd crashed at a friend's place. Maybe they had car trouble. She called Tyler's cell, straight to voicemail, then Brandon's, same thing. By noon, the panic had settled into her chest like a stone. Greg drove around to a few usual spots, the diner, the park, the gas station where Brandon sometimes hung out with friends. Nothing. No car. No word. No sign. By 3 p.m., they filed a missing persons report. Initially, the police response was measured. "They're probably just out longer than expected," the responding officer said. "Happens all the time with kids their age." But Marlene pushed back. "Brandon needs insulin."
"He never leaves without it."
"Something's wrong." That was the first real red flag. As the hours passed, friends started gathering at the Rourke home. Some joined search efforts, driving through neighboring towns, scanning parking lots, wooded trails, roadside ditches. Others manned the phones, calling hospitals and friends of friends. By dusk, the entire neighborhood was on edge. Flyers were printed. A vigil was planned. Still nothing. As news of the disappearance spread, more puzzle pieces began to surface. Ronnie, the diner manager, said neither brother ever showed up. Nate confirmed Tyler had texted him earlier in the day saying, "We might swing by a little later." But nothing after that. A retired police officer who lived a few doors down offered quiet advice to the family. Start writing everything down. Any memory, any detail, someone will ask eventually. And so they did. Marlene remembered the argument Brandon had on the phone. Greg remembered a customer Brandon had once called bad news. Nate remembered that cryptic comment from Tyler. But there was still no trace. The days turned to weeks. The case intensified. The family did interviews, handed out flyers, lit candles on the porch every night. Tyler's art teacher organized a fundraiser to support a reward for tips. Brandon's co-workers held a car wash, still nothing. Some started whispering behind closed doors. Maybe the boys had gotten mixed up in something. Maybe they left on purpose. But those who truly knew them, their habits, their routines, their hearts, refused to believe that. They were good boys, said Mrs. Livingston, their elderly neighbor. They wouldn't disappear. Not like this, but the trail was ice cold. Then, on the morning of July 11th, just before dawn, a jogger stumbled across a vehicle near the edge of a wooded area off Route 108. It was Brandon's 1996 Toyota Camry. The driver's door was cracked open. The keys were still in the ignition. One of Tyler's sketchbooks was on the passenger seat, untouched. No signs of a struggle, no blood. No damage, just silence. Police arrived within the hour. The car was dusted for prints, nothing usable. A K-9 unit was dispatched, but rain the night before had likely washed away any scent trail. Inside the glove box was Brandon's insulin kit, unopened. Marlene cried when they confirmed it was the car. She didn't need further proof. She knew, but no bodies were found. No signs of where the boys had gone. No evidence to point to what happened after they parked there. Investigators tried to keep the family hopeful. This doesn't mean the worst, one detective told them. We just don't know yet. But in her heart, Marlene did. Whatever had happened, it started here. In that car, on that night, someone had met them, or followed them, or waited. Whatever it wasn't random. It wasn't over yet. What could have possibly turned a peaceful evening into the start of a nightmare, and what happened between the car being parked? And the silence that followed? July 7th, 2001, had begun like any other muggy summer Saturday in Olney, Maryland. The cicadas were out early, buzzing lazily through the trees, and the temperature hovered stubbornly above 85 degrees well into the late afternoon. For the Rourke family, it was an ordinary weekend. Errands, laundry, yard work, leftovers from the night before. Brandon had spent part of the afternoon fine-tuning the alignment on an old dirt bike a neighbor dropped off. Tyler had sketched quietly at the kitchen table, earbuds in, lost in a playlist he rarely shared with anyone else. The two brothers had made plans to meet up with a few friends that night at Ronnie's Diner, a late-night staple on the edge of town where greasy burgers met jukebox music and cheap milkshakes. It wasn't unusual. They went there almost every other weekend, sometimes to hang out, sometimes to plan weekend trips or meet with friends who were back from college for the summer. At 7:58 p.m., Tyler called their friend Nate, letting him know they were heading out shortly. "We might be a little late, gotta swing by somewhere first," he said. The statement seemed routine at the time, a casual aside, but in hindsight it would become a focal point of the investigation. What was that detour? Brandon grabbed his keys from the hook near the door. Tyler slipped his sketchbook into his backpack as he always did, and the two left with a casual, "See you later," to their parents. Marlene glanced at the clock. It was 8:05. That was the last time anyone in the Rourke family saw the brothers alive. Later reports would confirm sightings of Brandon's 1996 Toyota Camry cruising southbound along Route 29 at approximately 8:17 p.m. One witness, a gas station clerk, remembered the car distinctly because of the faded rear bumper sticker, "Support your local mechanics." Another driver thought they saw the car pull into the old service station on Quarry Mill Road, abandoned for years. surrounded by tall grass and graffiti-tagged metal. No one could confirm if the brothers got out. When Brandon and Tyler failed to show up at Ronnie's diner, their absence was noticed but not alarming. Friends assumed they'd changed plans or had car trouble. It wasn't until the next morning, when Marlene woke up to find their rooms empty and their beds untouched, that concern turned to fear. She tried calling their cell phones. Both went straight to voicemail. Greg drove to Ronnie's himself. No sign, no one had seen them. They weren't with Nate or Jamal or Claire. No one had heard from them since that vague message from Tyler the night before. At 12:45 p.m. on July 8th, Marlene called 911. "My sons never came home last night," she told the dispatcher. Her voice was tight, calm, but already laced with dread. The officer who arrived was polite but unconvinced. "They're both over 18, he said. "It's not uncommon for young guys to stay out late, maybe crash at a friend's place." But as Marlene explained that Brandon never left home without his insulin, and both wallets were still in the bedroom drawer, the tone shifted slightly. Notes were taken. Descriptions were logged. The real alarm bells didn't start ringing until late that evening, when a statewide bolo, B, on the lookout, was issued for Brandon's Toyota Camry. It was now officially a missing persons case. By July 9th, the community response was in full motion. Volunteers gathered at the community center to organize search parties. Flyers were posted on telephone poles, church bulletin boards, and convenience store windows. Missing brothers, Brandon and Tyler Rourke, last seen July 7, 2001. Their smiling faces stared out from every corner of town. Local police expanded the search perimeter. Woods near the old service station were combed. Drones hadn't yet become common use, so officers and volunteers relied on grid-style foot searches, K9 units, and aerial scans from a borrowed state police helicopter. But there was nothing. No tire tracks, no footprints, no abandoned clothing, no struggle, no signs of life or death, just silence. If they hadn't run away, and there was no sign of a crime, then how did two brothers simply vanish without a trace? As the second day without contact stretched into a third, the Rourke family's anxiety turned into something darker, an inescapable sense of dread. Marlene stopped sleeping. Greg barely ate. Their home, once filled with the rhythm of ordinary life, became a hub for search coordinators, detectives, and news reporters. The media caught on quickly. "Two Maryland brothers missing after late-night drive," read the headline in the Montgomery Gazette. Local TV crews showed up on the Rourke's front lawn. Images of Brandon and Tyler were suddenly everywhere, flashing across screens, printed in newspapers, pinned to corkboards in every high school and library within a 30-mile radius. The boys' friends were interviewed one by one. Nate repeated what Tyler had told him, that they were planning a stop before heading to the diner. Claire mentioned a recent argument Brandon had been in at the garage, something about a missing tool and a customer he didn't trust. Jamal recalled that Tyler had become noticeably quieter in recent weeks, but none of it added up to something sinister. These weren't troubled teens or kids spiraling out of control. They were two brothers with goals, routines, and families that loved them. The initial theories ranged from the plausible to the absurd. Some believed the boys had simply left town, eloped with girlfriends, or taken off to a music festival. But that theory unraveled fast. Their wallets, IDs, and Brandon's insulin had all been left behind. Tyler's laptop sat open on his desk. His final project for a digital illustration course was halfway done, due the following Monday. If they had run, they had done it with none of the things they would need to survive. Others whispered darker theories. Had the boys crossed someone? Had they seen something they weren't supposed to see? Was it a drug deal gone bad? The rumors were hurtful, especially to Marlene, who fiercely defended her son's characters. They weren't perfect, she told reporters, but they were good. They were smart, and they were loved. They didn't just walk away from this life. The police, meanwhile, were working in quiet urgency, canvassing the area, reviewing old surveillance tapes, interviewing everyone who had crossed paths with the brothers in the previous 72 hours. Nothing pointed to a definitive direction. Then came a small break. A tipster called in, claiming they had seen a light-colored sedan parked just off Quarry Mill Road on the night of July 7th. Around 8:30 p.m., the area was rural and unlit, bordered by overgrown woods and a defunct service station that had long since been shuttered. It was the kind of place teenagers occasionally visited to drink, smoke, or dare each other into mischief, but nothing more. The lead was vague but specific enough to warrant a targeted search. On July 11th, around 5:40 a.m., a jogger cutting through a path near the old service station spotted a car tucked behind a row of tall bushes near a gravel turnoff. The windows were fogged. The license plate was partially obscured by mud. He called it in. It was Brandon's Toyota Camry. The car was eerily untouched. The doors were unlocked, the keys still in the ignition. Tyler's well-worn sketchbook lay on the passenger seat. There was no sign of a struggle. No broken glass. No discarded clothing. No blood. The glove box contained Brandon's unopened insulin kit. Inside the trunk, police found nothing out of the ordinary, just a few tools, a hoodie, and an old gym bag. The car's interior was swept for prints, but nothing definitive emerged. Either the perpetrator had worn gloves or the evidence had been expertly wiped. The discovery changed everything. It no longer looked like a runaway case. The boys hadn't just disappeared, they had been taken, lured, or intercepted. And whoever was behind it had been careful, calculated, and disturbingly silent. The car was found. But where were Brandon and Tyler? And why had they been so thoroughly erased from the scene? Finding Brandon's car only deepened the mystery. While it offered the first tangible clue, it also raised a far more disturbing question. How could the brothers vanish so completely, yet leave behind the very vehicle they drove that night, untouched, unmarked, and parked in a place they had no known connection to? The Camry was transported to a forensic garage for full processing. Investigators combed through every inch, under the seats, in the lining of the doors, inside the air vents, and within the tire wells. Nothing conclusive. No hair samples, no bloodstains, no fibers. The interior was spotless, too spotless. That in itself became suspicious. Brandon was known for keeping his car lived in, as he called it. A spare sock in the back seat, random receipts on the floor, maybe an empty soda bottle or two. But this car had been wiped clean. Even the usual signs of use, fingerprints on the steering wheel or gear shift, were absent. Someone had taken the time to remove traces. Someone who didn't want to be found. Meanwhile, detectives retraced the boys' last known movements. Surveillance footage from local traffic cams showed Brandon's Camry heading south on Route 29. At 8:17 p.m., it passed an intersection just 5 minutes from the old service station. But after that, it vanished from all camera records, no exit, no return. Just gone. It was as if the car had turned off the road and into a void. The property surrounding Quarry Mill Road was owned by a development company, but had remained unused for over a decade. The abandoned service station where the car was found hadn't had functioning lights or utilities since 1994. Its windows were smashed, the roof partially collapsed. The area wasn't under surveillance, and its isolation made it a prime location for anything meant to go unseen. The working theory quickly shifted. The brothers had either arranged to meet someone there or had been tricked into stopping. And then there was Tyler's cryptic comment to Nate, "We might swing by somewhere first." What was the detour? Who were they meeting? A team of searchers was dispatched to canvass the surrounding woods. Police dogs were brought in, but rain the night before had severely hampered scent detection. Footprints near the vehicle had been trampled by the jogger who found it, further muddying the scene. Still, volunteers combed through brush, shallow ditches, and trails. Hope was fading, but no one was giving up. Greg and Marlene were there each day, waiting at the edge of the search zone with paper cups of coffee, eyes scanning the woods like they might spot their boys walking out from the trees. Their hope was a quiet one, the kind that lived beneath heartbreak, flickering but never extinguished. By July 13th, police formally declared the disappearance suspicious. The case was elevated and a task force was formed. FBI liaisons were called in to assist with profiling and coordination. Media coverage ramped up again. News anchors replayed drone shots of the area where the car was found. Speculation flooded the airwaves. Was it a kidnapping? Were the brothers in the wrong place at the wrong time? Could this be connected to any other missing persons cases in the region? But there were no demands, no ransom notes, no anonymous calls, nothing to suggest a motive or an endgame. In the town of Olney, anxiety tightened its grip. Parents kept children indoors. People checked locks twice. Whispers of a predator, someone hiding among them, floated through barbershops and grocery stores. The idea that someone could make two young men vanish, leave no evidence, and walk away unseen, it haunted every street. Greg found himself sitting in Brandon's car at night after it was returned from processing. The silence inside was suffocating. He touched the dashboard, the gear shift, the steering wheel. All the places Brandon's hands had once been. It felt like standing in a ghost. "We were so close," he whispered once, gripping the wheel tightly, so close to stopping it. But they hadn't. And now the silence left only questions. The car had been found. But why was it empty? And where had Brandon and Tyler gone after they stepped out of it, for the last time? It was the kind of discovery no one ever forgets. 3 days after Brandon and Tyler Rourke's car was found abandoned off Quarry Mill Road, a hiker named Raymond Tucker set out early in the morning with his German Shepherd, Daisy, for a walk through the backwoods of Patuxent River State Park, an area dense with trees, underbrush, and old trails rarely used since the early 90s. Raymond was a retired teacher who'd taken up morning hikes for exercise and quiet. That particular morning, the forest felt especially still, the kind of stillness that carries weight. About 2 miles into the trail, Daisy suddenly darted off into a thick patch of brush, barking loudly and circling a cluster of uneven ground near the base of an old, gnarled tree. Raymond pushed through the undergrowth to retrieve her and stopped cold. There, in the shade of that ancient oak, lay what first appeared to be disturbed earth, but it was more than that. The smell hit him first, the sharp, unmistakable scent of decay. And then the shapes came into view, 2 shallow depressions in the soil, loosely covered in pine needles and branches. He called 911 with shaking hands. Police arrived within the hour, quickly taping off the area. As crime scene investigators began clearing away the debris, it didn't take long to confirm what they feared. 2 human bodies, both male, both bound at the wrists with zip ties behind their backs, buried side by side in makeshift graves less than 2 feet deep. Identification came quickly. Brandon Ellis Rourke and Tyler Marcus Rourke. Their IDs were not on them, but the clothing matched what they'd been last seen wearing. Dental records confirmed by the family's own statements made it official. The Rourke brothers were dead. The news swept through the community like a tidal wave. Grief, shock, anger, all colliding in the same breath. People gathered at local churches, community centers, anywhere they could be near one another. The idea that 2 young men, known for their kindness, their ambition, their bond, had not just gone missing but had been murdered and dumped like trash in the woods, was almost too much to comprehend. Greg and Marlene were told the news in person by lead detective Marcus Heller. Heller had been on the case since the beginning and had begun to take it personally. He sat across from them in their living room, hat in hand, and delivered the news with the kind of solemn professionalism that never softens the blow. Marlene collapsed in Greg's arms. Brandon had been shot twice in the chest. Tyler, once in the back of the head. The forensic team believed the killings were execution style. Tyler's body showed signs of bruising, likely from restraint or a struggle. Brandon had defensive wounds on his forearms. Both had been killed elsewhere and moved to the burial site afterward. The placement of the bodies, side by side, carefully arranged, suggested a deliberate act, not an impulsive one. The graves were shallow, but the attempt to conceal them was real. Someone had taken time to choose the spot, dig and cover. But there was something else. There were no fingerprints, no DNA under their fingernails, no stray hairs, no cigarette butts or shoe prints, nothing. The scene had been meticulously cleaned. The zip ties were generic, sold in thousands of stores across the country. The bullets had no unique markings and had been removed from the bodies before burial, likely to prevent ballistic tracing. This wasn't a random act of violence. It wasn't sloppy. It was methodical, cold, and deeply personal. Who would go to such calculated lengths to eliminate 2 young men, and why did the killer leave nothing behind? As the forensics team completed their work at the burial site, detectives back at the station faced the grim reality that this case was no longer a missing persons investigation. It was a double homicide. The sudden shift in tone echoed through the entire department. What had been a desperate search for 2 missing brothers had now become a manhunt for a calculated killer. The media responded instantly. "Brothers found dead in Maryland woods," one headline read. Police investigate execution-style murders in cold case twist, read another. The autopsy reports only deepened the sense of horror. Brandon had likely died first. He had 2 gunshot wounds to the chest, close range. Tyler's cause of death was a single gunshot wound to the back of the head, but his body showed contusions across his upper arms and neck. Investigators believed he may have been forced to watch his brother's murder before being killed himself. Dr. Lenora Briggs, the chief medical examiner, described the scene as one of precision and premeditation. She noted the absence of hesitation marks or signs of panic. This wasn't rage, she told Detective Heller. It was a message, but I can't tell you what it said. The crime scene yielded no forensic evidence, no shell casings, no DNA, no footprints. Whoever had committed this double homicide had come prepared, and that meant they had done something like this before, or had watched enough to know how to avoid mistakes. Detectives started reconstructing the brothers' final hours. The detour they made before the diner became the centerpiece of the timeline. Investigators now believed that the stop, whether voluntary or coerced, was part of a trap. But for what? It didn't look like a robbery. Brandon's wallet, though found later in his bedroom, would have likely been on him if they were meeting someone casually. Tyler had nothing valuable on his person. There were no signs of ransom demands or attempts at extortion. The Rourkes weren't involved in drugs. They had no known enemies. They weren't in trouble with the law. The obvious motives, money, revenge, jealousy, seemed to fall flat. But there were whispers. Detectives followed up on rumors Brandon had been worried about someone at the garage. A former co-worker named Dave Letson had been fired months earlier for stealing catalytic converters and reselling them. He was later arrested for aggravated assault in a different county. Brandon had been the one to report him to their boss. When questioned, Letson denied ever threatening Brandon. "Yeah, we didn't get along, but that's it," he said. "I ain't killed nobody." His alibi, being out of state with a girlfriend, checked out. They also explored Tyler's world. At the bookstore where he worked part-time, he'd recently had an argument with a strange man over a disputed return. The man had refused to give his name and became aggressive. But the surveillance footage had long since been erased, and Tyler never reported the incident formally. Every thread investigators pulled unraveled into nothing. What they couldn't ignore, however, was the sheer deliberateness of the crime, the burial, the execution-style killings, the total absence of evidence. Someone wanted these boys gone, and knew how to make it look like they never existed. Candlelight vigils were held across town. Hundreds gathered holding signs that read "Justice for Brandon and Tyler," and wearing black armbands in solidarity. Churches offered grief counseling. A local high school art teacher began painting a mural of the brothers downtown, based on Tyler's own sketchbook work. And through it all, the Rourke family grieved in agonizing silence. Greg, once a quiet man who stayed out of the spotlight, began giving interviews. "Someone knows something," he said on live TV. "You don't kill 2 boys like this and keep it a secret forever." His voice cracked on the final word. The case had shifted into something bigger than a tragedy. It had become a symbol, a wound in the heart of a peaceful town. And still the question remained, if it wasn't random and it wasn't personal in the usual ways. What kind of darkness had the brothers stumbled into? In the days following the discovery of Brandon and Tyler Rourke's bodies, the case took on a chilling dimension. The brutality of the murders, the precision in how the brothers were silenced, and the utter lack of forensic clues suggested one thing. The killer hadn't just been lucky, he had planned every second. Lead detective Marcus Heller, a 17-year veteran of homicide investigations, was deeply unsettled. He'd seen rage killings, crimes of passion, botched robberies, even gang executions. But this one was different. The cold efficiency pointed toward someone with experience, or at the very least, someone who had studied how to make people disappear. Heller began consulting with a criminal profiler from the FBI's Baltimore field office. The profile that emerged wasn't comforting. According to the profiler, the killer likely had a personal connection to at least one of the victims but didn't act out of impulse. Instead, the act was controlled, deliberate, and meticulously executed. There were no signs of overkill. The spacing of the gunshots, the restraint method, the shallow but organized graves, all signs of someone with purpose and calm under pressure. This was business for them, the profiler said. It may have felt personal to the victims, but it was procedural to the killer. But what kind of business? That's where the answers began to dry up again. Detectives revisited the notion that Brandon may have witnessed or threatened to report something criminal at the garage where he worked. There had been whispers in the community about illegal side deals, stolen parts, and possible money laundering, but nothing that ever reached formal charges. Could Brandon have threatened to come forward? Had he confided in Tyler? The garage's owner, Bill Matheson, was cooperative but evasive. He downplayed any talk of criminal activity and insisted Brandon was never involved in anything shady. He was a good kid, Bill said. Quiet, came in early. Stayed late. Never talked about trouble. Still, Matheson had no explanation for why Brandon had mentioned being followed. In the weeks before his death, a detail confirmed by one of Brandon's co-workers who remembered a conversation where Brandon asked if anyone had seen a blue pickup tailing him from work. Tyler's life was examined again, too. Investigators dug into his recent artwork, hoping that perhaps his sketches might offer subconscious clues, images of strange figures, distorted scenes, abstract depictions of fear or paranoia. A few stood out. One in particular showed two boys standing on the edge of a dark forest, facing a shadowy figure with no face. Another showed a car under a spotlight surrounded by ghostly outlines of people. They weren't evidence, but they were chilling. Greg and Marlene clung to the hope that something would break. They believed someone in their community knew more than they were saying. Heller agreed. They started offering interviews to any outlet that would listen. Greg appeared on regional news programs. Marlene wrote an op-ed that was published in the Baltimore Sun. "If you knew my sons," she wrote, "you knew how much light they brought into a room. I beg you, don't let that light go out with silence." Tips trickled in, but none led anywhere definitive. A former student of Marlene's claimed he saw Brandon arguing with a man in a black hoodie 2 weeks before the disappearance, but couldn't give a face or name. A jogger said she thought she heard gunshots the night of July 7th, but assumed it was fireworks. A local bar patron claimed to have overheard 2 men talking about kids getting buried like dogs, but was too drunk at the time to recall more than that. Every lead brought a rush of hope, and every dead end brought it crashing down. Again, investigators were baffled. There was no pattern, no motive they could confirm, and no suspects who stuck. And yet the cruelty of the crime couldn't be ignored. 2 young men, brothers, taken from their family and community with surgical cruelty. And so, rumors spread that it was a professional hit, that the boys had stumbled onto something too big, that a local ring of corruption was involved, that they had been mistaken for someone else, that it wasn't just about them, it was about sending a message. Speculation consumed the public. But for detectives, speculation wasn't enough. They needed proof. Something, anything that could lead to an arrest. The crime scene left no answers. So what would the investigation uncover next? And could anyone be trusted to tell the truth? The murders of Brandon and Tyler Rourke had stunned the community, but in the weeks that followed, something more troubling took hold. Doubt. Doubt in the system. Doubt in the investigation. Doubt in whether justice would ever come. From the very beginning, cracks began to appear in the case's foundation. While local police made public statements assuring the community that every lead was being followed, behind closed doors, key witnesses were being overlooked. Timelines weren't properly confirmed, and important evidence, such as security footage from nearby roads, was requested too late to be recovered. Detective Marcus Heller, who had taken the case to heart, found himself increasingly frustrated. He was doing all he could, but not everyone in his department shared his urgency. Bureaucratic hurdles slowed search warrants. Interagency cooperation between the county sheriff's office and state forensic labs was, at best, inconsistent. And a lack of funding meant wait times on forensic testing stretched weeks into months. Then came the internal tension. Some of Heller's colleagues questioned the usefulness of continuing to pour resources into a case that, as one officer bluntly put it, probably isn't solvable. Others were quietly wary of where the investigation might lead, especially when certain names began to surface. One of those names was Mason Keller. Keller was a known associate of the local salvage yard, rough around the edges former felon, and a familiar face to law enforcement. He had once worked part-time at Bill's garage, overlapping briefly with Brandon before being fired for attitude problems. Keller had a reputation for intimidation, small-time threats, unpaid debts, and rumored involvement in an underground car parts trade. But when detectives attempted to interview him, the request was inexplicably delayed for over a week. By the time Keller was brought in, he had a clean-cut alibi and a lawyer already present. He refused to answer any questions and was released without charge. It was a moment that shook Heller. He began wondering whether someone inside the department was tipping people off. Whispers started in town that the crime scene had been compromised, that investigators hadn't properly secured the area where the bodies were found, that the car had been returned to the Rourke family before all advanced forensic testing had been completed. The Rourkes themselves were not immune to these doubts. Greg, usually restrained in public, began pressing harder in interviews. "We're told we're a priority," he said during a televised press conference. "But I want to know, what does that really mean? Because from where I'm standing, my sons are in the ground and no one has paid for it." Marlene, once composed, now openly wept during interviews. She wrote letters to the governor, to state senators, even to the U.S. Department of Justice asking for oversight, for accountability. She never received a reply beyond the standard acknowledgments. As weeks turned into months, momentum began to stall. Lead after lead fizzled. Suspects were questioned, then let go. Tips dried up. And though detectives insisted the case was still open and active, there was a growing feeling among the public that it had already gone cold. Local activists demanded transparency. A community watchdog group filed a formal complaint regarding the police department's handling of the case. At a town hall, emotions boiled over when residents confronted the chief of police with accusations of negligence. "You lost them," one woman shouted, "and now you're losing the truth," the chief deflected. Promised integrity, promised resources, but promises weren't evidence, and the Rourkes were still waiting for answers. Were these failures the result of incompetence, or was someone deliberately keeping the truth buried? As public confidence in the investigation eroded, the tension between the Rourke family and the authorities became impossible to ignore. The family, once patient and quietly cooperative, now openly questioned the very people they had initially trusted to bring them answers. Detective Marcus Heller found himself caught in the crossfire. Internally, he was pushing harder than ever. He'd started a personal timeline, independent from the official case file. A map of sightings, a log of every interview conducted, a side notebook with names that didn't make it into official reports but still raised alarms. He wasn't ready to accuse anyone of sabotage, not yet, but the inconsistencies were mounting. Case files went missing for days at a time. Evidence logs were incomplete. Digital backups were strangely corrupted. Too many errors to be coincidence. And then there was the call. A month after the discovery of the brothers' bodies, Heller received a voicemail from an anonymous number. The voice was distorted, disguised, but the message was clear. "You're asking the wrong questions. Someone close is covering it up. Look at the call logs from July 6th, you'll find your ghost." Heller pulled the logs. One number stood out. A burner phone that had pinged a nearby tower the night of July 6th and again on the 7th, within a half-mile of where the brothers' car was later found. But there was a problem. The request to obtain tower records had been denied earlier by a supervising officer, citing insufficient probable cause. That officer was Lieutenant Scott Devlin. Devlin had served with the department for over 20 years. He was known for playing politics well, smiling for press briefings, keeping donors happy, and managing optics more than investigations. He had also been seen multiple times meeting with Mason Keller, the same man many believed had something to do with Brandon's fears at work. Heller took his suspicions to the department's internal affairs division quietly, carefully, but nothing came of it. No follow-up, no review, just silence. Meanwhile, Marlene Rourke continued her quiet campaign for federal oversight. With every unanswered letter, her resolve hardened. She began documenting everything: calls made, responses received, inconsistencies in the investigation. Greg started calling media outlets directly. "If the law won't speak for them," he told a local reporter, "then I will." The town grew restless again. One evening, someone spray-painted "Justice for the Rourkes" across the front doors of the police station. A week later, a printed flyer circulated in coffee shops and schools, listing names of potential persons of interest, based on rumors and speculation. The flyer included the name of Lieutenant Devlin. The department issued a statement denouncing the accusations as reckless and unfounded. But the damage was done. Trust was broken. Heller was reassigned temporarily to another case. Officially, it was to help with the backlog. Unofficially, it was punishment for pushing too hard, but he didn't stop. He kept working the case off the clock, visiting witnesses again, revisiting reports, trying to piece together a puzzle with missing pieces, some misplaced, others possibly hidden on purpose. Then the Rourkes received something strange in the mail. It was an unmarked envelope. No return address. Inside were 3 photographs, one of Brandon's car at the abandoned station taken from a distance, one of a figure in a dark hoodie walking through the woods, and one of 2 shallow mounds of earth. Before the bodies were recovered, there was no note. No explanation. Just images. They turned everything over to police. Heller requested a full forensic analysis, but the photos yielded little. No faces, no timestamps, just more questions. Still, someone had taken those photos. Someone had been watching. Maybe even involved. And if they were willing to send them now, it meant the case wasn't just fading away. It was actively being interfered with. The question remained, by who? And why? Was someone inside the system sabotaging the case, or were they protecting a secret too dangerous to expose? By the fall of 2001, the official investigation into the Rourke brothers' murders had slowed to a near halt. No new evidence had surfaced. No arrests had been made. Behind closed doors, a fog of bureaucracy, fear, and possible corruption clung to the case like a permanent shadow. But in the Rourke household, the clock hadn't moved. Marlene still placed 2 cups of coffee on the kitchen table every morning, one for Brandon, one for Tyler. Greg still checked the porch at sunrise and sunset, a silent habit he couldn't seem to shake. Their grief had calcified into something harder. Not just mourning, but resistance. They weren't going to let the system forget. When Detective Heller was quietly pulled from the case, the family knew something deeper was wrong. Heller had been the only investigator to consistently return their calls, share updates, and give them honest answers, even when those answers were painful. Now he was gone, replaced by a younger detective who followed procedure with rigid politeness but offered nothing. We're doing everything we can, the new detective would say, but he wasn't. Everyone knew it, and still the whispers continued. About connections between local businesses and law enforcement, about buried records, about phone logs mysteriously erased or never properly requested. One rumor suggested the service station where the boy's car had been found had once been used by off-duty officers for side jobs and unrecorded vehicle work, possibly as a front for stolen car, parts nothing could be proven. But the smoke was thick. At a town council meeting, Marlene stood and spoke with a trembling voice, her hands shaking as she clutched a photo of her sons. "I'm not here to make enemies," she said. "I'm here because someone in this town knows who killed my boys, and someone else is making sure that truth doesn't come out. If you can live with that, fine. But I can't and I won't." The room fell silent, and then a single person clapped, then another, until nearly the entire chamber was on its feet. The council promised to review departmental procedures. But the family had heard that line before, and so they kept pushing. They launched a website to gather tips from the public. Volunteers joined in, helping to document timelines, cross-reference statements, and create digital maps of the known movements leading up to the murders. Independent podcasters picked up the story. A true crime YouTube channel ran a 2-part series on the case that gathered nearly 800,000 views. The pressure was building, yet for all the eyes on the case, for all the data points and community support, there were still no charges, no confession, no closure. Greg and Marlene often asked themselves the same question at night. Why? Why kill them? Why execute them, bury them, and erase them? Theories continued to circulate. A drug ring cover-up, a witness elimination, a mistaken identity. But the one that haunted Marlene the most was simpler and darker. That someone with influence had decided their lives weren't worth the consequences of the truth. There are crimes of passion, crimes of greed, crimes of desperation, and then there are crimes of silence, The Rourke brothers' case was becoming the latter, buried not just under pine needles and dirt, but under red tape, closed doors, and official statements that said everything and nothing all at once. But hope, while wounded, was not gone. Detective Heller, though off the case, continued to stay in touch. "I'm not finished," he told Greg in one call. "They may have shut me down, but they haven't shut me up. And I still believe the truth is out there." Greg didn't cry. He simply said, "Then keep digging." With the investigation stalling and trust shattered, how long could the family hold on before the trail went cold for good? By early 2002, the Rourke case had begun its slow descent into silence. The news cycles that once opened each broadcast with Brandon and Tyler's smiling photos now focused on newer tragedies. The headlines changed. The reporters left. And the town, though scarred, resumed its quiet rhythm. But for Greg and Marlene Rourke, time had stopped the day their sons' bodies were pulled from the earth. Their house became a shrine to what was lost. Brandon's bedroom remained untouched, his tool set still on the desk, a pair of oil-stained gloves draped over the chair. Tyler's room was filled with sketches still taped to the walls, swirling skylines, faceless figures, a half-finished canvas leaning against the closet. They didn't have the heart to move anything. It wasn't clutter, it was memory. Birthdays came and went. So did holidays. There were no new photos, only frames with dust and silence. Every unopened letter, every missed call, they were echoes now. Ghosts of a life that had been violently severed. Greg threw himself into work, adding more shifts, anything to avoid the stillness of the house. Marlene stopped working altogether. She volunteered at the local library, but mostly to distract herself. Grief didn't fade. It just changed shape, hardening, quieting, waiting, and as the Rourkes mourned, the investigation faltered. By 2004, Detective Marcus Heller had been fully removed from the case. Officially, it was labeled a reallocation of departmental resources. Unofficially, many believed he had pushed too hard into areas others wanted left untouched. The files were reassigned to newer detectives, ones unfamiliar with the nuances, the context, the human cost. One by one, the leads grew cold. Suspects moved. Witnesses forgot. Evidence degraded. The lab backlog for DNA analysis, once their biggest hope, became months long. When a sample from a zip tie came back with no conclusive results, it felt like the final nail. In 2005, the department quietly reclassified the case as inactive pending new evidence. No announcement. No explanation. Just a quiet line on an internal memo. The public didn't notice, but the Rourkes did. They kept calling every few months. "Any updates? Anything new?" The responses were always polite, always vague. "We're reviewing some things. There are still some angles we're pursuing. We haven't forgotten." But they had. The urgency had faded, replaced by procedural inertia. By 2007, the case was officially cold. Files stored in a drawer, labels faded, contacts outdated, and in the world outside, Brandon and Tyler's names began to drift into memory, spoken only in whispers at vigils, remembered by aging teachers, former classmates, friends who now had families of their own. But not everyone moved on. In a small apartment above a coffee shop in Frederick, Maryland, a journalist named Ellen Pierce kept a box labeled Rourke Brothers beneath her desk. She had been a junior reporter at the time of their deaths, fresh out of college, assigned to cover community events. But the Rourke murders had changed her. "I remember their mother," she once said, the way she spoke about them, not just with pain but with urgency. She wasn't just grieving. She was trying to hold on to something that the world wanted to let go. Ellen had covered the story for 2 years, but even after her editor moved her to other assignments, she kept following the case on her own time. She clipped articles, filed FOIA requests, interviewed neighbors off the record. She didn't know what she was chasing, but she knew the story wasn't over, and neither did someone else. Detective Heller, now retired, still kept the Rourke file in his home office. It sat on a shelf next to war novels and baseball memorabilia. Some nights he'd reread old notes, redline contradictions, and quietly asked the questions that no longer had a department backing them. "I made them a promise," he said once, "and I intend to keep it." What happens when the world forgets, but two people won't let the silence win? By the time 2010 arrived, nearly a decade had passed since Brandon and Tyler Rourke were taken. In Olney, the streets they once skateboarded down were lined with newer families, unfamiliar faces. Kids too young to remember the vigils rode past the mural of the brothers without stopping, the vibrant paint fading just enough to seem like a relic of another era. But inside the Rourke home, time refused to bend. The living room still held the same brown sofa where the boys once argued over the TV remote. Tyler's old sneakers sat at the base of the stairs. Every inch of the house was curated with memory, untouched not out of denial but reverence. It had become a place frozen in sorrow, kept sacred by two parents who refused to move forward without knowing why their sons had died. Greg had grown quieter with age. His shoulders stooped more than before, and his hands, once calloused from long shifts, trembled when he held the photo albums. He no longer chased media attention. That flame had dimmed, but it hadn't died. At night, he still rewatched recorded interviews, still replayed news segments on an old DVR, still whispered their names before sleep. Marlene, meanwhile, had transformed her grief into purpose. She began attending victim advocacy events across the state, speaking at panels and quietly supporting families of other unsolved cases. She never spoke with bitterness, only with the quiet, exhausted clarity of someone who knew what it meant to wait too long for answers. "There's nothing more painful," she once said during a conference in Annapolis, "than having to beg the world to remember your children." She met others like her, parents, siblings, children of the disappeared. Some found justice. Others, like her, were still trapped in the purgatory of silence. But together, they became a small community of the unresolved. And within that pain, something began to stir again. Meanwhile, in Frederick, Ellen Pierce continued piecing together the forgotten puzzle. By then, she had left her reporting job and started working freelance, mostly grant-based research and true crime features for small regional publications. But the Rourke case stayed with her. It haunted her in ways other stories didn't. She had once interviewed Brandon's co-worker, the teacher who mentored Tyler, even the jogger who found the Camry. But in 2010, she revisited the original evidence from a new angle. Technology had changed. Digital archives were growing. Old phone records, once considered too broad to analyze, could now be scanned and cross-referenced with software. Surveillance video, grainy and overlooked, could be enhanced frame by frame. Ellen submitted a new FOIA request to the state archives, this time targeting the cell tower pings near the area where the car had been discovered. She had requested the same data years earlier but had been denied. This time, the records came through. What she found stunned her. A burner phone had pinged the tower 3 separate times between July 6th and July 8th, 2001. That phone had never been traced. Never linked to a name, but it had been within a half-mile radius of both the crime scene and the Rourke home. At the time, the data had been logged but never deeply analyzed. She brought the information to Marcus Heller. Though retired, Heller still knew people inside the department. Quietly, he asked for help pulling old call logs from Brandon's contacts. Nothing matched the burner. But it didn't have to. The location data placed the phone exactly where Brandon and Tyler had vanished. Not just once, but multiple times. Someone had been watching. It was the first new lead in years. Together, Heller and Ellen began rebuilding the case from the ground up. Not officially, not with badges or warrants, but with dogged resolve and a growing arsenal of digital tools that didn't exist when the boys were killed. Behind closed doors, something was shifting. Was this burner phone a breadcrumb? Or the first crack in the wall that had sealed the truth away for 2 decades? The burner phone wasn't a breakthrough yet, but it was the first tangible piece of data in years that pointed to something, or someone, that had eluded the original investigation. Ellen Pierce and retired Detective Marcus Heller began quietly working in tandem, combing through the 2001 case archive. The deeper they dug, the more disturbing the gaps became. Reports misfiled, interview transcripts missing, evidence logs that skipped over key items. And yet, amid the disarray, patterns began to emerge. One of those patterns led them back to Quarry Mill Road, the same stretch of desolate asphalt where Brandon and Tyler's Camry had been abandoned. Reviewing old traffic records, Ellen located a secondary report that had never been referenced in the main case file. It mentioned a white utility van spotted parked on the shoulder of Route 108 the night of the disappearance. It had no plates and no one had ever followed up. Further investigation revealed a curious overlap. In 2001, a man named Derrick Wade had been living less than 3 miles from the site. His juvenile record was sealed. His adult life appeared quiet. On paper, he was unremarkable. Blue-collar jobs, no major arrests, kept to himself. But Heller remembered the name. Wade had once been picked up in a separate investigation into stolen auto parts, an operation that had loosely brushed against the garage where Brandon had worked. Wade was never charged. His name had surfaced briefly, and then disappeared when the case was deprioritized. Now, Wade's name came up again, this time tied to a phone number that had appeared in one of the burner phone's past contacts. The number wasn't registered and the call was short, less than 30 seconds. But the date and location placed it less than 24 hours before the Rourke brothers were last seen. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a whisper in the dark. Ellen and Heller took their findings to a private forensic tech consultant, someone Ellen had worked with on a previous story. The consultant began reprocessing digital evidence from the old case files, using modern enhancement software on the surveillance footage pulled from the gas station near Route 29. Frame by frame, clarity emerged. It wasn't enough to identify faces, but a figure could be seen stepping out of a white van. Not Brandon. Not Tyler. A third man, tall, heavy-set, hoodie drawn up. He walked toward the Camry, and then vanished out of frame. In 2001, that footage had been deemed too grainy to be useful. In 2012, it was a roadmap. The consultant also reprocessed audio from a 911 call made. The night of July 7th, a woman had reported 2 cars idling too long near the old station and said she heard a loud pop like firecrackers or maybe a gun. The dispatch had never led to a patrol unit being sent. The voice in the call, frightened, uncertain, still had the recording's timestamp intact, 8:43 p.m., less than 30 minutes after Brandon and Tyler were last seen. The pieces weren't just fragments anymore. They were forming a shape, jagged, incomplete, but real. Heller typed up a full summary of the findings. He submitted it directly to the cold case unit at the state level, bypassing the local department entirely. The file was titled Rourke Double Homicide, Supplemental Evidence Package. For the first time in years, the case file was reopened, quietly, officially. Back in Olney, the Rourkes didn't know any of this. Not yet. They still walked each day in silence, still lit candles on anniversaries, still spoke their sons' names into the dark, but change was coming. Justice, once buried under years of silence, was beginning to stir. Could new eyes, new tools, and old memories finally bring the truth to light? After all this time, for over 2 decades, the murder of Brandon and Tyler Rourke had lived in the cold shadows of unsolved crime. Grief preserved in boxes, memories faded into paper files, and questions left to echo into silence. But in the spring of 2023, a small envelope arrived at the Maryland State Crime Lab, addressed to the Forensic Genealogy Unit. Inside was a sample, older than most they received. Long considered unusable by traditional testing standards, it had been collected from beneath Tyler Rourke's fingernails during the autopsy, preserved for over 20 years in refrigerated storage. The original analysis had come back inconclusive, and the DNA had been too degraded to match against any criminal database at the time. Back then, if it didn't hit in CODIS, it went nowhere. But science had changed. With the advent of advanced mitochondrial DNA sequencing and forensic genetic genealogy, the impossible was now plausible. Samples that were once considered too degraded could now be amplified, compared and cross-referenced against public databases, thanks, in part to voluntary submissions from people using home DNA kits to trace their ancestry. The Maryland Cold Case Unit had recently partnered with Paragon Genomics, one of the most reputable forensic genealogy labs in the country. The Rourke case was one of the first they handed over, quietly, without press, without fanfare. No one wanted to raise hopes again. Not yet. Weeks passed. Then a call came in. The sample from Tyler's fingernails had yielded a viable profile, not a direct match. Not a name, but a genetic trail, a partial family tree leading to a common ancestor. The genealogists began the painstaking work of building the tree backward, then forward again. They identified a line of relatives, some living in Virginia, others in Pennsylvania. Dozens of branches, hundreds of names. Most could be ruled out quickly: age, gender, geographic impossibility. But one name stopped them cold: Derrick Wade. He lived in Montgomery County, just 2 miles from where Brandon's car had been found in 2001. He had lived there then, too, under the radar, in a rented room above a motorcycle repair shop. His name had appeared briefly in the original case logs, tied to a tip that had never been fully investigated. At the time, he was 19, old enough to kill but young enough for his prior criminal record to be sealed. No one had looked at him since, but now he wasn't just a name. He was a genetic match. When the cold case detectives reopened the file, the original lead investigator, Detective Marcus Heller, was consulted informally. Though long retired, his institutional memory was invaluable, and when he heard Wade's name, his blood ran cold. "I remember him," Heller said. "He was trouble. But we were told not to waste time on dead ends. This time, no one was brushing it off. Surveillance was initiated. Investigators quietly pulled Wade's employment history, property records, and financial data. He had worked in auto salvage, moved around often, kept a low profile, no major run-ins with the law in years, but a few disturbing details surfaced: a sealed juvenile arrest for assault with a weapon, a domestic disturbance in 2010 that didn't result in charges, an expunged case tied to a stolen vehicle in 2003. Then came the second test, the clincher: a discarded coffee cup, collected from a trash can outside a local convenience store, was retrieved during surveillance. It was sent to the lab for direct DNA comparison. It matched. The genetic profile from the cup was a full match to the DNA found beneath Tyler Rourke's fingernails. For the first time in 22 years, investigators had something real: a name, a location, a scientific link that placed Derrick Wade in direct, physical contact with one of the victims during or immediately before his death. But science only goes so far. Now that they had DNA and a name, could they connect Derrick Wade to the crime scene, the motive, and the moment everything unraveled? The DNA was the breakthrough they needed, but it was not the conviction. For the Maryland Cold Case Unit, the challenge now shifted from science to strategy. They had a name. They had a genetic match. But they still lacked what any prosecutor would demand: context, motive, corroboration, a story to support the science. Derrick Wade had no recent criminal record. He paid his taxes. He kept to himself. He worked contract jobs in construction and salvage yards. And on the surface, he looked like a man who had moved on from whatever troubled past he might have had. But the case files told a different story. Detective Serena Lopez, who had taken the reins from the aging cold case team, began assembling a full background profile on Wade. What emerged was a timeline punctuated with violent outbursts, frequent changes in address, and a pattern of proximity to criminal activity without ever being caught in the middle of it. Lopez tracked down a former girlfriend who had filed a domestic complaint in 2010. Though the charges were later dropped, her interview painted a disturbing portrait. "He had this switch," she said. "1 minute calm, the next rage. And he was always paranoid. Said people were watching him. Always carried a box cutter. Slept with it under the pillow." Then came the most telling detail. He mentioned something once about burying the past, literally. "Said it during a fight when I told him he needed help. I didn't understand what he meant. Thought he was just being dramatic." Lopez logged the statement. It wasn't proof, but it was a chilling echo. Working with the forensic team, she revisited the original burial site photos. At the time, the graves had seemed hastily dug. But now, with more advanced analysis, investigators noticed something subtle: precision. The graves had been measured to fit adult male bodies. They were placed side by side, oriented identically, with branches and foliage intentionally layered to match surrounding terrain. This wasn't panicked improvisation. It was planning. More pressure was added to the timeline when Ellen Pearson, still actively working with Detective Marcus Heller behind the scenes, discovered an archived email from 2001. It had been sent by Brandon's former co-worker at the garage. alerting the owner that Wade's been hanging around again asking about Brandon. Weird energy. Said he had unfinished business. That email had never made it into the case file, but now it was a critical breadcrumb. The theory began to take shape. In the months before his death, Brandon Rourke had expressed concern about being followed. He had clashed with individuals around the garage's illicit dealings. Wade, briefly employed there, had a history of violence, was fired, and reportedly held grudges. He lived close to the location where Brandon's car was later found. And now, 2 decades later, his DNA was under Tyler's fingernails, defensive evidence in a double homicide. Still, Wade wasn't talking. Investigators couldn't move too fast. If Wade caught wind of the investigation, he might run, or worse, destroy potential evidence. Lopez pushed for a quiet grand jury presentation. Prosecutors began preparing the case for potential indictment under Maryland's revised Cold Case Justice Act, which allowed for sealed indictments when new DNA evidence emerged in connection with a violent felony. Meanwhile, the surveillance team expanded. Wade was observed visiting a small repair shop in Gaithersburg, Maryland, an unofficial business that appeared to work almost exclusively in cash. No signage, no website, just a row of old cars and the hum of tools. It was the kind of place that didn't ask questions. One night, Wade was followed to an abandoned property he'd visited before. He stayed inside for only 15 minutes before returning to his truck. The next morning, Lopez and her team searched county records. The building had been vacant for years, owned by a shell company connected to a long-defunct salvage business. They applied for a covert search warrant. Inside, beneath floorboards blackened with oil and time, they found a storage crate. It contained rusted car parts, torn tarps, and a pair of gloves. The gloves were old, faded, weathered by years in storage, but DNA swabs were collected and rushed to the lab. 6 days later, the results came back. One partial profile matched Brandon Rourke. They had the DNA, and now they had physical evidence, but was it enough to prove Derrick Wade had pulled the trigger 22 years ago? The gloves were old, possibly decades old, but the DNA still spoke. The partial profile pulled from the inside seam matched Brandon Rourke's genetic markers. While the sample was degraded and couldn't determine exactly how or when the transfer occurred, it placed Brandon's biological material on an object found inside a building connected to Derrick Wade. And that building, just like Wade, had never been mentioned in the original investigation. It was a needle in a haystack. But in the world of cold case prosecution, sometimes a needle was all it took to reopen the wound and get it stitched shut the right way. Detective Serena Lopez prepared her final affidavit. She laid out the case with the precision of a scalpel. DNA beneath Tyler's fingernails, full match to Wade. Surveillance reanalysis. A white van with a figure matching Wade's build near the abduction site. Archived email. Brandon had been warned about Wade's reappearance. Burner phone data. Tower pings placed. Wade near the drop site. The gloves, physical evidence connecting Wade to Brandon, found in a hidden property tied to Wade's past. Witness interviews. Wade's ex-girlfriend referencing cryptic confessions, patterns of rage and threats about buried secrets. The circumstantial weight was now bolstered by science and intention. It wasn't just presence. It was connection, the state's attorney agreed. A sealed indictment was drafted. A judge approved the arrest warrant. On February 17, 2024, at 6:11 a.m., a tactical team surrounded Derrick Wade's residence on the outskirts of Damascus, Maryland. He was asleep when they breached the door. No struggle, no protest, just confusion in his eyes as handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. "You're under arrest for the murders of Brandon and Tyler Rourke," the lead agent said. Wade said nothing. He was escorted into the back of a black SUV and driven straight to a secure facility in Rockville. The news broke within hours. For the Rourke family, it was a moment they had long stopped believing would come. Greg was folding laundry when the knock came. Marlene was in the backyard watering dormant rose bushes. The detective stood on their porch with tears in her eyes. "We got him," she said. "We got him." Greg collapsed onto the porch steps, hands over his face. Marlene didn't speak. She just nodded, then finally allowed herself to cry without restraint. For the first time in 22 years, those tears weren't born of despair, but release. That night, Olney lit candles again, but this time not in mourning. This time, in defiance. The arrest brought media back to town. The same reporters who had long moved on now scrambled to cover the twist in a case they'd forgotten. Headlines read, DNA breakthrough cracks 22-year cold case in Maryland. Forensic genealogy leads to arrest in Rourke brothers' murders. Justice, at last. Ellen Pierce stood at the edge of the press crowd, notepad in hand, watching it unfold. She didn't ask a question. She didn't need to. The story was no longer just hers. It belonged to the community, to the Rourkes, to the victims who had waited so long to be heard. But as much as the arrest answered one question, it raised others. What had been Wade's true motive? Was it revenge, silence, a hit gone wrong? Why Brandon? Why Tyler? And had he acted alone? Derrick Wade invoked his right to remain silent. No confession, no statement, no visible remorse. In his booking photo, he stared directly into the lens, expressionless. For prosecutors, the challenge ahead would be formidable. Decades-old evidence, a case built largely on circumstantial connections and scientific inferences, but they had what they needed to proceed. A name, a match, and a timeline that made sense. They were building a narrative. And for the Rourkes, for Heller, for Lopez, and for the entire town that had lived with the weight of this mystery, that narrative was no longer a question. It was a promise. The arrest brought relief. But could the justice system finish what science had started? It was just after 6 a.m. on February 17, 2024, when the chill of winter clung to the rooftops of a quiet suburban street in Damascus, Maryland. The world was still asleep, except for the officers moving silently in the darkness, tactical gear strapped tight, radios muted to a whisper. They had surrounded a modest single-story home tucked at the edge of a cul-de-sac, its faded blue siding and neatly trimmed shrubs giving no indication of what lived behind its walls. Inside, 43-year-old Derrick Wade was still in bed. To neighbors, Wade was just another working-class man trying to stay afloat in a hard economy. He kept to himself, helped shovel driveways in the winter, occasionally chatted with the mail carrier. He was known for barbecuing in the summer, waving to passing cars and showing up at church twice a month with his teenage son. Nothing about him screamed danger. Nothing whispered murderer, but by sunrise the story would be very different. As the lead agent knocked on the front door, another team moved around the back. Wade opened the door in a t-shirt and sweatpants, bleary-eyed and confused. He didn't resist, didn't argue. When they told him he was under arrest for the murders of Brandon and Tyler Rourke, he blinked just once and quietly held out his hands. It was over in minutes. Word spread like wildfire. By 9 a.m., local news stations were broadcasting the arrest live. Breaking: man arrested in 2001 cold case murders of Rourke brothers. Social media flooded with reactions: shock, confusion, and disbelief. Former classmates, old co-workers, longtime neighbors. None of them could believe it. Derrick Wade, a murderer? The man they remembered had graduated from the same high school as Brandon. He was 2 years ahead, quiet, average grades, mostly kept to himself. He'd fallen off the radar shortly after school and resurfaced sporadically over the years. No scandals, no arrests, just the occasional odd glance or short temper. But beneath that surface, investigators now believed was a very different man. The theory had crystallized over the months leading up to his arrest. Wade had worked briefly at the same garage as Brandon Rourke in 2001. Multiple witnesses described tension between them. Arguments, accusations, and most damning, the implication that Brandon had threatened to report suspicious activity involving stolen car parts and drug trafficking tied to a few employees. Brandon was clean, focused, determined to build an honest life. Wade, on the other hand, had already begun slipping into Maryland's small but violent undercurrent of backdoor criminal activity, helping move stolen parts, laundering money through junked vehicles, and possibly running small amounts of narcotics through fixer garages. Brandon, they believed, was a liability, and Wade, unstable and fiercely paranoid, decided to remove that liability permanently. But what made the betrayal even more chilling was the personal history. Wade hadn't just worked with Brandon, he had known him, sat in the same classrooms, walked the same hallways, shared the same neighborhood streets in their youth. Brandon's family had even hosted a summer cookout once where Wade was present. There was history there, enough to mask a crime of such deliberate cruelty behind the illusion of familiarity. That's what made it so devastating for the community. He ate at our table, Greg Rourke later said. He laughed in our backyard. All the while, he was capable of this. Wade's arrest fractured the small town of Olney anew. While many residents rejoiced at the long-awaited breakthrough, others were left stunned that the killer had lived so close for so long, blending into the ordinary, hiding in plain sight. Neighbors described his demeanor post-arrest as eerily calm. No yelling. No denial. No visible emotion. I saw him being let out, one woman said, and he looked right at me. Not scared. Not angry, just blank. He was behind bars. But could a man who hid in plain sight for 23 years be convicted beyond reasonable doubt? The arrest of Derrick Wade brought a long-awaited shift in momentum, but it also ushered in a new wave of uncertainty. With the handcuffs secured and headlines blazing, the spotlight now turned toward the most unpredictable phase of any cold case, preparing it for trial. Prosecutors faced a daunting task. This wasn't a crime freshly committed with a clear trail of evidence and live witnesses. This was a 23-year-old double homicide, stitched together through forensic genealogy, fragmentary surveillance, reconstructed witness testimony, and circumstantial motive. It would take precision to turn that mountain of data into a story that could survive the scrutiny of a jury. State's Attorney Melinda Voss, a seasoned prosecutor with a reputation for cold case convictions, was tapped to lead the charge. She spent her early days poring over every shred of evidence the team had accumulated. The DNA match under Tyler's fingernails, the partial profile from the gloves found in Wade's former property, the phone tower pings, the surveillance footage enhanced by modern AI tools, and the witness statements both from decades ago and those gathered in the past year. It was strong. But Voss knew it needed to be airtight, so she brought in experts. A forensic genealogist was retained to explain in layman's terms how a distant family match could lead to a suspect, and how rare that margin of error truly was. A forensic pathologist would testify to the nature of the wounds and the timing of the struggle. And a behavioral analyst would help shape the jury's understanding of Wade's mindset, drawing connections between his past violent behavior and his capacity to execute a crime so precise and unfeeling. But even with science on their side, the prosecution still faced a central problem. They could theorize that Brandon's moral stance and possible threats to expose illicit garage operations had triggered Wade. But they didn't have a confession. And Wade was staying silent. His public defender, Philip Greaves, a sharp and often aggressive courtroom figure, was already preparing to dismantle the case at its core. Greaves called the DNA incidental, claiming it could have come from casual contact at the garage or from Wade handling the same tools or surfaces as Tyler. As for the gloves, how many people had access to that abandoned property over the years? Greaves asked during an early hearing. And who's to say those gloves weren't planted or contaminated? You want to send a man to prison for life based on a pair of rotting gloves? The press latched onto it instantly. DNA hero or legal house of cards? One op-ed asked. But for the Rourkes, there was no doubt. They had waited too long, cried too many nights, stood beside too many cold gravestones to waver now. Marlene remained stoic in public appearances, her voice calm but unwavering. We're not looking for vengeance, she told reporters. We're looking for truth. And justice. Greg, whose voice had grown quieter with the years, offered only this. He knows what he did, and now the world will know too. Meanwhile, the community held its breath. Candlelight vigils turned into fundraisers for victim advocacy groups. A scholarship in Brandon and Tyler's names, dormant since 2015, was revived and flooded with donations. The mural of the brothers in downtown Olney was restored, this time surrounded by names of other Maryland cold case victims still awaiting justice. But not everyone believed. In small corners of the internet, conspiracy theories began to churn. That Wade was a scapegoat, that the DNA was manipulated, that the real killer was never caught. These ideas, though fringe, gained traction in the online true crime world, casting doubt into places where none had been before. It was noise, dangerous, distracting noise, but the legal system had a way of cutting through it. The preliminary hearings were scheduled. The stage was set, but as the courtroom prepared for trial, The big question remained. Would science and memory be enough to stand against a defense built on doubt? And would the jury believe the past could still speak clearly after all these years? As the legal machine began to move, the world around Derrick Wade began to unravel. His arrest had sent shockwaves through both the Rourke family's circle and his own. Family members, friends, and neighbors who had known him for decades were now forced to reconcile the quiet, helpful man they believed they knew with the cold, calculated violence he was accused of committing. Wade's teenage son, who had grown up unaware of his father's connection to the case, was placed in the care of relatives. His longtime partner refused interviews but released a single statement. "We are devastated and trying to process the impossible." Derrick himself remained almost entirely silent. At his arraignment, he pled not guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. He appeared in a gray suit, slightly disheveled, flanked by his defense attorney. He did not look at the Rourkes, who sat in the front row. Marlene clutched a photo of her sons, her hand trembling, but her eyes fixed on the man accused of ending their lives. From the beginning, the defense strategy was clear: sow doubt, discredit the evidence, and focus on the passage of time. Attorney Philip Greaves argued that the DNA evidence was circumstantial, that the gloves were meaningless without a clear chain of custody, and that no direct witness or confession tied Wade to the murders. "He's been a free man for 23 years, Greaves told the court. "Why now? Why this?" Because of some half-matched DNA and assumptions built on fading memories, the prosecution pushed back hard. They presented the DNA under Tyler's fingernails, matched directly to Wade's discarded coffee cup. They displayed the cell tower records and showed how the burner phone had pinged near both the Rourke home and the woods where the bodies were found. They played enhanced surveillance footage showing a white van eerily similar to one Wade had access to back in 2001, and placed him within a mile of the drop site. But Greaves countered with questions meant to fracture the narrative. "Where's the murder weapon?" he asked. "Where are the ballistics? Where's the confession?" It was enough to make the courtroom feel tense. Enough to make even those closest to the case wonder, would it be enough? Yet the prosecution had one more card to play. A former co-worker of Wade's, who had remained silent for years, finally stepped forward. He was living out of state now and had seen news of the arrest online. In a video deposition, he claimed that in late July 2001, just weeks after the murders, Wade showed up drunk to a friend's house and, in a rambling state, said, "That kid at the garage? He's not going to be a problem anymore." While it wasn't an outright confession, it was damning. Combined with the other circumstantial evidence and DNA match, it added a layer of character and intent. Still, the prosecution knew that everything hinged on presentation. They needed the jury to believe the science, to believe the patterns, to see not just pieces but a complete portrait of a man who had killed 2 young brothers and buried their lives under decades of lies. As the trial date neared, anticipation reached a boiling point. Local news stations covered it daily. True crime podcasts dissected every motion and every pretrial hearing. People gathered outside the courthouse with signs, some in support of the Rourkes, others questioning the state's case. Inside their home, the Rourkes prepared themselves for the courtroom showdown they had waited nearly a lifetime to see. "We've waited 23 years for this moment," Greg told a journalist. "And no matter how it ends, the world will finally hear our son's story in full." The pressure was immense, the stakes higher than ever, because in the courtroom, evidence must do more than speak. It must convict. Would the jury see the truth behind the years of silence, or would the weight of time allow a killer to walk free once again? By the time the trial of Derrick Wade began in November 2024, it had already been dubbed the case that haunted Maryland. Cameras were not allowed inside the courtroom, but that didn't stop dozens of journalists, bloggers, and true crime commentators from staking out the courthouse steps each morning, their breath fogging in the early winter chill as they waited for any new headline to emerge. Inside, the courtroom was packed to capacity. The Rourkes sat front and center day after day. Marlene wore a silver locket with photos of Brandon and Tyler tucked inside. Greg kept a worn notepad in his lap, where he scribbled quotes, timelines, or simply pressed the pen down so hard the paper tore. They never missed a moment. Not the opening statement, not the medical examiner's testimony, not the long hours of legal argument that often blurred into exhaustion. This was not just a trial. It was a reckoning. The prosecution opened with a powerful narrative. Brandon Rourke had discovered illegal activity at the garage where he worked, specifically, the funneling of stolen car parts and possible drug trafficking through local auto shops. He had made threats to expose it. He was young, idealistic, and perhaps unaware of the danger those threats posed. The key suspect? Derrick Wade, a former employee connected to those activities with a violent past and a growing paranoia. He had motive. He had opportunity. And crucially, he had a direct DNA link to one of the victims. But more than that, the state argued Wade had a reason to silence Brandon, and in doing so, had taken Tyler with him. Brandon was the target, Assistant State's Attorney Melinda Voss told the jury, but Tyler was family, and Wade knew that silencing one meant silencing them both. The defense countered swiftly. Attorney Philip Greaves painted a picture of Wade as a convenient scapegoat, targeted by a desperate system clinging to weak forensics and speculative motives. He claimed the DNA was coincidental, the glove evidence corrupted, and the entire timeline stitched together by people with biases and old grudges. He questioned chain of custody, asking how evidence from 2001 could be trusted in 2024. He cross-examined the state's expert on forensic genealogy for hours, forcing them to explain complex concepts to a lay jury that sometimes looked overwhelmed. And he reminded them, again and again, that no murder weapon had been recovered. No confession? No eyewitness. There are pieces, Greaves said, but the puzzle is incomplete. And in this country, that means you don't put a man in prison for life. The prosecution didn't back down. They brought in Brandon's former boss, who testified under oath that Brandon had expressed serious concern over something shady going on with a few employees, including Wade. He'd even warned Brandon to be careful. They brought in a forensic pathologist who walked the jury through the injuries, how Brandon had defensive wounds, how Tyler's single gunshot to the back of the head indicated execution-style killing. They played the enhanced surveillance footage again. A grainy figure, a white van, the timestamp placing it just minutes after Brandon and Tyler were last seen, and then came the most emotionally charged day of the trial. The testimony of the former co-worker who had come forward just months before. He sat stiffly in the witness box, voice steady but eyes haunted, as he recounted Wade's drunken admission. He's not going to be a problem anymore. The courtroom fell silent. Some jurors wrote notes. Others simply looked at Wade. He sat still, hands folded, eyes locked straight ahead. Would these layers of testimony, science, and memory be enough to tip the scale toward justice, or would doubt, however thin, cast its long shadow over the verdict? As the trial entered its second week, tension inside the courtroom became nearly unbearable. Jurors now wore the burden of knowing they would be the ones to decide whether a man who had lived freely for 23 years would spend the rest of his life behind bars or walk away once again into the world. Every piece of testimony was dissected. Every bit of forensic evidence, every cross-examination, and every emotional statement was absorbed and weighed. The prosecution continued to fortify their case. They brought in Dr. Eliza Tran, a forensic genealogist with over 15 years of experience, to explain in simple terms how investigators had narrowed Derrick Wade's identity through distant familial DNA connections. She described the methodology, how the tree had been built, and how Wade's name surfaced through careful cross-referencing of age, geography, and criminal history. It's not just a guess, Dr. Tran said confidently. It's probability rooted in biology. And it narrowed to one man, Derrick Wade. The defense immediately tried to poke holes. Greaves suggested that genealogical methods, while improving, were fallible. He implied that errors in the family tree could mislead investigators. "You're not matching his DNA," he repeated. "You're matching his cousin's uncle's niece. That's not guilt. That's a guess." But the prosecution had more than guesses. They reminded the jury of the direct match, Tyler's DNA under his fingernails, and Wade's saliva from a discarded cup. It wasn't just family proximity. It was a match. And then came the gloves. Found in a decaying crate inside a condemned property once linked to Wade, they contained partial DNA belonging to Brandon Rourke. The prosecution admitted the samples were degraded, but argued that their presence alone in a place Wade had access to and used to frequent, was another piece of the puzzle that couldn't be ignored. Gloves don't lie, Assistant State's Attorney Melinda Voss said. They don't walk themselves into storage crates, and they certainly don't randomly carry the DNA of a murder victim unless someone put them there. But Greaves wasn't finished. He attacked the state's timeline. He brought forward a digital expert who testified about the limitations of 2001 surveillance technology. This is not CSI, the expert warned. Pixels don't tell the whole truth. He also presented a former landlord of Wade's who insisted Derrick was quiet and normal in 2001. He never brought trouble, the man said. He was just trying to get on his feet. Perhaps most forceful was his closing argument, in which Greaves turned to the jury and said, "We are not here to judge Derrick Wade as a man. We are here to determine whether this evidence proves beyond a reasonable doubt that he killed Brandon and Tyler Rourke, and it does not." It was a strategic appeal, not to sympathy but to caution. The Rourkes sat through it all with unwavering resolve. Marlene occasionally squeezed Greg's hand. She never looked at Wade. Instead, her eyes stayed fixed on the jury, silently begging them not to let silence win again. The judge, a soft-spoken but stern woman in her 60s, issued her final instructions with clarity. "You must base your verdict only on the evidence you have heard and seen in this courtroom. Not emotion, not speculation, only evidence." And then, just like that, the jury was dismissed to deliberate. For the first time in weeks, the courtroom emptied. Reporters hovered in the halls. The prosecution huddled in a back room, pacing. Greaves sat alone with his notes, calm but unreadable. Greg and Marlene returned home to wait. And time once again stood still. Would the jury return with justice? Or would the weight of 2 decades leave them uncertain, afraid to reach beyond the fog of time? The jury deliberated for nearly 3 full days. Inside their closed room, 12 strangers weighed the sum of 2 decades of pain, evidence, and testimony. They reviewed surveillance stills, rewatched video depositions, re-listened to 911 calls. Notes were scribbled, timelines redrawn, arguments exchanged. The weight of their responsibility sat heavy on every sigh, every glance. Outside, the world waited. Each day, Greg and Marlene Rourke arrived early, taking their usual place on the courtroom bench. They sat silently through the uncertainty, hands often intertwined, eyes fixed on the double doors that would eventually swing open and deliver the final word. Reporters swarmed the courthouse lawn. Podcast crews whispered predictions, camera flashes snapped at every recess, and live panels debated whether this was justice in the making or a case built on shadows. Then, on the afternoon of the 3rd day, the message came. The jury has reached a verdict. Inside the packed courtroom, silence fell like a curtain. The air was thick. Wade sat beside his attorney, stone-faced as always. He wore a dark gray suit, the same he'd worn during opening arguments. He showed no signs of nervousness, no twitch, no tremble. The Rourkes, barely breathing, leaned forward as the judge addressed the foreperson. "In the matter of the state of Maryland versus Derrick Wade," the judge said, voice steady but solemn, "have you reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." The foreperson stood, holding the small sheet of paper that held the answer to 23 years of agony. "For the charge of first-degree murder of Brandon Ellis Rourke, we find the defendant guilty. For the charge of first-degree murder of Tyler Marcus Rourke, we find the defendant guilty." Gasps filled the courtroom. Greg buried his face in his hands. Marlene wept, her shoulders shaking as tears fell in silent release. Across the room, even members of the jury wiped their eyes. Years of grief, hope, fear, it all collided in that single irreversible moment. The judge thanked the jury and ordered Wade back into custody to await sentencing. He stood, was cuffed again, and led from the courtroom without a word. Not once did he look back. Outside, news of the verdict spread like wildfire. Guilty verdict in cold case, murder trial of Rourke brothers. Justice, delivered after 23 years. Maryland cold case closed, but while the courtroom had spoken, the emotional reckoning was far from over. In a press conference that evening, Marlene stood at the podium. Her voice wavered, but her words were clear. "We spent 23 years waiting to say this. Brandon and Tyler mattered. They mattered to us, to this community, and now, finally, to the law. We are grateful for everyone who never gave up." Justice was not swift, but it came. And we're here to witness it. Greg simply nodded beside her. They can rest now, he said. Derrick Wade would later be sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was quieter that day, less crowded, but for the Rourkes it was a second kind of closure, a confirmation that this time justice wouldn't slip away. Still, the trial had left scars. It reopened old wounds, tested faith, and reminded everyone of the fragility of memory, evidence, and trust. But it also showed what could be done when a case is never truly abandoned, when science, persistence, and courage intersect. For Detective Heller, who had watched the trial from the gallery, the verdict was bittersweet. "It's what we fought for," he said afterward. "But I wish it hadn't taken this long." And Ellen Pierce, the journalist who'd helped bring new eyes to the case, offered a final reflection in an op-ed. "In a world filled with noise, sometimes it's the quiet stories, the ones buried deep, that demand the most attention." Brandon and Tyler were silenced. But through this trial they spoke again, loudly, clearly, forever. Justice was served. But what would the legacy of the case become, and how would the memory of 2 lost brothers continue to shape those left behind? The day after Derrick Wade was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms, the Rourke home was quieter than it had been in years. Not silent, never truly silent, but calmer. For over 2 decades, Greg and Marlene Rourke had lived in a space where time seemed fractured. The house had become a memorial, a holding chamber for grief and memories, a place where everything felt unfinished. But now, with the weight of the trial lifted and the verdict delivered, the long unspoken question lingered in the air like a fragile promise. What happens now? The answer, in part, began with closure. The Rourkes held a new burial ceremony, more symbolic than formal. Brandon and Tyler had already been laid to rest years before, but this was different. This was for peace, for finality. At a small gathering in the cemetery where their sons' gravestones stood side by side, close friends, relatives, and former classmates gathered once more. This time, there were no missing posters. No search dogs, no flashing camera bulbs, just wind, sunlight, and quiet remembrance. Greg read a letter he'd written but never mailed, a message to his sons. "I'm sorry we couldn't protect you," he said, voice trembling. "But we never stopped fighting. You deserved the truth and we never let it go." Afterward, Marlene placed a new bouquet of white roses at each headstone and whispered, "Rest now. We did it." But even as the Rourkes found space to breathe again, the impact of their son's story was only just beginning to ripple outward. The courtroom drama, the forensic breakthroughs, and the persistence of a grieving family captured national attention. True crime documentaries were soon in production. A 2-part special aired on a major streaming platform, chronicling the 23-year journey from tragedy to justice. It featured never-before-seen photos of Brandon and Tyler, recorded interviews with Ellen Pierce and Marcus Heller, and exclusive footage from inside the courthouse. One clip, in particular, went viral. Marlene speaking after the verdict, holding a framed drawing Tyler had made in high school. 2 brothers standing together beneath a rising sun. She had kept it for 23 years. "He always said he wanted his art to speak," she said. "Now it has." The case became a cornerstone in criminal justice classrooms across the country. Students studied the timeline, the forensic genealogy process, and the legal strategy that ultimately led to the conviction. Professors used it as a case study in perseverance and the evolving role of science in law enforcement. In Maryland, the impact was legislative. Inspired by the Rourke case and others like it, state lawmakers introduced the Cold Case Justice Reform Act. The bill proposed increased funding for DNA testing, streamlined access to genealogical databases, and the creation of a permanent cold case unit within the Maryland State Police. It passed unanimously in both chambers and was signed into law in April 2025. Governor Leslie Ortega, during the bill's signing, cited the Rourkes by name. "This family never stopped believing in the truth," she said. "And now, because of their courage, we're giving other families a fighting chance." Greg and Marlene attended the ceremony. They didn't speak, but the standing ovation they received spoke volumes. Back in Olney, the community took steps of its own to honor the brothers' memory. The mural downtown, once a faded tribute, was repainted with fresh color and new detail. Brandon, depicted in his garage uniform, stood beside Tyler, clutching a sketchbook. Above them, the words, "Perseverance, Truth, Legacy," Local. Businesses donated funds to launch 2 scholarships in the brothers' names. The Brandon Rourke Memorial Scholarship for automotive trades would be awarded annually to a high school senior entering vocational training in mechanical work. The Tyler Rourke Creative Arts grant would support young artists pursuing illustration, animation, or graphic design. Both programs were overseen by a non-profit founded by the Rourkes themselves, an organization focused on cold case victim advocacy and youth opportunity. Its name, the Rourke Foundation. The boys were gone, but could their legacy now reach further than their lives ever had the chance to? The Rourke Foundation began modestly, built from the ashes of grief and the embers of a long-fought battle. What started as a scholarship program quickly evolved into something more powerful, a living testament to Brandon and Tyler's lives, and a platform that gave their voices continued resonance in a world that had once forgotten them. The foundation held its first annual memorial event in late summer 2025. Just 4 months after the bill signing, what might have been a small, solemn gathering turned into a community-wide celebration of resilience and remembrance. The town park filled with folding chairs, music, food trucks, and hand-drawn signs bearing the boys' names. Art students painted live murals. A local high school auto shop displayed restored classic cars in Brandon's honor. Former classmates of the brothers took the stage to share memories, stories of Brandon's quiet work ethic and Tyler's boundless imagination. And when the scholarship recipients were announced, there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. The first mechanical scholarship went to a teenager named Malik Johnson, who spoke about losing his father and how working with his hands helped him stay grounded. Brandon's story showed me that even quiet people can leave the loudest echoes, he said. The Creative Arts grant was awarded to a young artist named Sofia Ramirez. Her application portfolio had included a haunting sketch of 2 figures emerging from the woods hand in hand, into light. She didn't know the Rourkes personally, but after researching the case, she said, "I felt like I did." Greg and Marlene watched from the front row, hand in hand. They weren't just the grieving parents of lost sons anymore. They had become pillars, witnesses to what happens when tragedy is met not with surrender, but with tenacity. In the months following the event, letters began arriving at the Foundation's modest office, handwritten notes from parents of other missing children, survivors of violence, and law enforcement officers inspired by the case. One letter came from a mother in Arizona whose daughter had disappeared in 1999. The case had long gone cold, but the renewed attention on forensic genealogy gave her hope. "Your story reminded me that sometimes it just takes one more voice to make the system listen," she wrote. "Thank you for being that voice." Detective Marcus Heller, now fully retired, joined the foundation as an advisor. He helped build out a program that partnered with police departments across Maryland, offering workshops on best practices in cold case handling, how to preserve aging evidence, how to work with victim families, how to resist the pull towards cynicism and bureaucratic fatigue. The Rourke case taught us that no matter how old a case is, Heller said at a training event, it's still alive somewhere, in a drawer, in a memory, in a piece of evidence waiting to speak. Ellen Pierce published a book titled Still Speaking, The Fight to Solve the Rourke Murders. It became a regional bestseller and was nominated for a national award in investigative journalism. In it, she chronicled not just the facts of the case, but the human toll, the nights Marlene sat alone with her son's sketchbooks, the day Greg stopped fixing the leaky sink because it was one of the last things Brandon had promised to do, the weight of a verdict delayed but not denied. The final chapter was titled, Legacy is Louder Than Silence. By late 2025, schools across Montgomery County had incorporated the Rourke case into their curriculum. High school seniors debated its legal complexities in mock trials. College students built case studies around its forensic breakthroughs. And everywhere the story was told, it left the same impression, that ordinary lives, when stolen too soon, can still change extraordinary things. What does it mean for 2 young men, gone so long, to still shape laws, dreams, and justice across generations? By early 2026, Brandon and Tyler Rourke had become more than the victims of a brutal cold case. They had become symbols of perseverance, of justice delayed but not denied, and of the enduring impact 2 young lives could have long after they were taken. Their names were etched not only on gravestones, but on legislation in classroom syllabi and in the lives of the scholarship recipients who carried forward their dreams. At the Rourke Foundation's second annual Remembrance event, the crowd was twice as large as the year before. This time, attendees included students from across the state, members of the Maryland State Police, cold case investigators from as far as Illinois and Ohio, and elected officials who had supported the DNA reform bill inspired by the case. The theme of the event was simple but powerful: carry it forward. Greg stepped up to the microphone, holding his notes tightly. He'd never been a public speaker, but over the years, his grief had taught him how to speak from the heart. His voice was quiet, steady. We once lived with silence, not by choice, but because no one had answers. And for a long time, we thought that silence would last forever. But it didn't, because people cared. Because people listened. Because people refused to give up. And now Brandon and Tyler live in the lives you're building. The applause was long, but Greg didn't linger. He stepped down and returned to his seat beside Marlene, who reached for his hand without a word. The keynote speaker that evening was a criminal justice student from the University of Maryland. Her senior thesis had been on the Rourke investigation. She spoke about how the case had reshaped her goals, not just to become a forensic investigator, but to help reform how cold cases are handled nationally. She ended her speech with a quote from Brandon's high school yearbook: "Stay steady, stay honest, keep going." That quote was later engraved on a new plaque installed at the Olney Town Square, a memorial that featured side-by-side portraits of the brothers, surrounded by mosaic tiles created by local students. Beneath their names was a single line: they were more than what happened to them. The foundation continued to grow, expanding its reach with national partnerships. It launched a podcast titled Unforgotten, which explored cold cases across the U.S., each season ending with a focus on how communities could support victim families and push for accountability. The first episode featured Marlene, her voice soft but certain. Justice isn't a moment. It's a process, and sometimes it's slow. But that doesn't mean it's not coming. Beyond media and policy, something deeper had changed. Communities across Maryland began creating local cold case advocacy boards, modeled after the Rourke Foundation's format. Grants for advanced forensic training increased. Prosecutors, investigators, and students began collaborating on dormant files, seeking overlooked evidence or possible DNA leads. And more than once, those efforts led to progress, sometimes even arrests. None of it could undo what was lost. Brandon would never open his garage. Tyler would never publish a graphic novel or teach a child how to draw the perfect skyline. Their futures were stolen, but their story became a seed, planted in pain, grown in persistence, and nurtured by a community that chose not to forget. For Greg and Marlene, the journey would never be over. Grief doesn't end. It simply learns to live alongside you. But as they sat together one quiet evening, listening to a voicemail from one of the scholarship winners thanking them for the opportunity to pursue a dream, Marlene looked over at Greg and said something she hadn't said in a long time. "They're still here, not just in us. In everything that's growing now." He nodded. "They changed everything." In death, Brandon and Tyler left behind something rare, proof that legacy, shaped by love and justice, can outlive tragedy itself. But what does justice really mean? When it's finally won, the story of Brandon and Tyler Rourke is not just one of loss, it is one of resilience, determination, and the enduring force of truth. What began as a senseless, unsolved double homicide in a quiet Maryland town grew into a decades-long fight for justice that would transform lives far beyond the Rourke family's doorstep. For 23 years, silence filled the spaces their laughter once echoed. Their bedrooms became memorials. Their absence became a permanent shadow in the lives of Greg and Marlene Rourke. Yet even in the absence of answers, they refused to give in. They stood up year after year, not just for their sons, but for every family who had ever felt forgotten by the system. It took new science, relentless journalism, and a retired detective's conscience to finally reopen what others had deemed unsolvable. But justice came, not in a dramatic moment, but in steady, patient steps. And when it finally arrived, it did more than convict a man. It restored faith. Brandon and Tyler's legacy now lives through scholarships that shape new futures, laws that open doors to forgotten cases, and young minds inspired by their story. Their lives, though tragically short, sparked real change. Let their journey remind us that the pursuit of truth does not expire. That time may bury answers, but it can never silence them. And that hope, no matter how long it takes, can still deliver justice to anyone still waiting for resolution. Hold on. Speak out. Keep going. Because Brandon and Tyler Rourke's story proves that even in the quietest corners of tragedy, justice still has a voice.